Hello, this is Christopher Morrison. This is Unit 7 assignment. In this assignment, I will compare the academic standards for reading in history and social studies to a current course that I'm teaching for sophomore honors social studies, which is an American history course throughout the 20th century United States. To begin, the assignment is set up with the yellow standards of the PA Common Core that are represented in yellow. These standards are the ones that I feel I accomplish in my course. And throughout the remaining parts of the assignment, the blue standards are the standards that I believe I cover, but probably not to the level of rigor that is supported by the Common Core standards. And the third section is for the pink standards. These standards are ones that I'm not confident that I complete or fulfill these standards based on the level that the Common Core would support. So to begin, I will move back to the yellow standards. Now, what I decided to do with this is for each of the standards for the yellow, blue, and pink, I decided to include a rationale for the standard. And really what I thought was I needed to prove to myself that these standards are ones that I feel I do accomplish. And for the other two sections, it helps explain. I think I do some of the standards for the blue, but maybe where I can improve on them. And for the pink standards, these are standards that I don't think I necessarily do, and I explain why through the rationale. So to begin with the first PA Common Core standard for reading in social studies, the first standard is cite specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources, attending to such features as the date and origin of the information. The rationale I created for this: students use a high number of primary and secondary sources. Analysis occurs through reading and developing a set of critical points to explain the purpose of the source. Quotes and passages from within the source are selected to help explain the central ideas. Features of a primary source that provide background information that can be used to predict the central ideas and point of view of the document. In my course, I use a lot of primary and secondary sources. Students are required to read, and I believe it helps them gain an understanding of what the main idea or central point of the reading is. So one of the things I focus on is having students read the information, and I don't necessarily give them a lot of questions, such as some teachers may have, oh, read this and then answer these questions. That's something that I've moved away from probably over the last several years, because what I find is when you do that, students just simply look for the answer and they don't read to find the actual central idea. So sometimes students will read documents and secondary sources and search for quotes, and we'll pick out a quote and analyze how does this quote tell us about the central idea. I thought one of the examples that I've recently used is the inaugural address by Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the beginning of the Great Depression when he was elected in 1932. Students receive the document, they read the document, and they end up summarizing or rewriting FDR's inaugural address. So it's not as simple as, all right, here's the address, tell me some of the main points. It's, here's the address, based on your interpretation, explain what is the message that FDR was giving to the American people when he made the inaugural address at one of the low points during the Great Depression. So the first Common Core standard, I definitely feel that I fulfill in my classroom. To move down, the second standard, letter B, determine the central ideas or information of a primary or secondary source, provide an accurate summary of how key events or ideas develop over the course of the text. Students read the source and develop a summary statement to explain the central idea. Summary statements must be supported by textual evidence. Central ideas or primary and secondary source are generated by students and supported with facts gathered from the sources and shared. Clarification of ideas from the sources occurs through teacher-supported discussion. When I talk to my students, I always give them an image of a Christmas tree. And often what they do is, as they read a document or a secondary source, what they are told is the top of the tree is your main idea sentence, or what some people might say is a thesis statement for what the document is telling us. But the central idea cannot stand by itself, so they are constantly looking to find the supporting ideas to help build or help support the main idea. And one of the examples that I'll use later in the year involves the causes of the Vietnam War. There are several documents and secondary sources that are used. Some are primary, and some are secondary sources that come from textbooks or other materials. And students will read these, and they don't necessarily read the same one. So one student may be reading a primary source, another student may be reading a secondary source, and based on the reading, they are to create a list of these are the causes, and the causes range from political causes to economic to military causes. And once students have had time to read it, then we come back together for them to state, this is what I believe the cause of the Vietnam War is based on my reading. And then students will often work in groups to discuss, well, this is what my reading says, and this is what I believe the cause is, and another student will have a different cause. So we get an idea of some of the different causes of the Vietnam conflict. So Common Core Standard 8.5.9-10B is another Common Core standard that I feel I accomplish in my classroom. The third standard, letter C, analyze in detail a series of events described in a text, determine whether earlier events caused later ones or simply preceded them. Students analyze the connection between a series of events and explain the cause and effect of each event. How did this event lead to the next event? Could have this event been prevented? Prediction based on prior information applies prior knowledge to determine the cause of the event. Explain the impact of the event on future events. In the chapter that I'm in currently right now with World War II, there's one lesson that I do dealing with why did the Japanese decide to attack the United States? Because most students have a question of how could this tiny island nation ever think they had a chance to defeat the United States. And through the use of a secondary source, students read and they create a timeline in which a series of events unfolds, and they are able to determine what events lead to the next event. And with this assignment, they are able to see, well, what are some of the precursors of Japanese expansion? Their geographic location, they're an island. They were having a population boom. They were running out of natural resources. So through a series of readings, they're able to determine one event which leads to the next event, such as they're running out of resources. That leads to them invading Manchuria in 1931. That leads to them getting involved in a war with China. And then because of their involvement with China, we come in to help support China against the Chinese, and eventually that leads to the Japanese attacking the United States. So we definitely talk about, could one event lead to another event, and if one event would not have occurred, could that have changed the course of an event? So Common Core letter C is another one that I feel confident that I complete within the classroom. Common Core F, compare the point of view of two or more authors for how they treat the same or similar topics, including which details they include and emphasize in their respective accounts. Students compare and contrast the points of view of various authors of primary sources. Each primary source represents a contrasting view. rewriting of author's point of view, support the point of view with textual information, including passages and quotes, defends the point of view of the author based on text, prior knowledge, relates the connection between author's point of view, political standing, and author's background. Primary sources is a staple that I have always included in my instruction and curriculum. Dealing with honor students, the expectation is that they have the ability to read at a higher level, primary sources especially. So just with the idea of being able to read one author's point of view and compare it and contrast it to another author's point of view is something that occurs weekly within my classroom. And most recently, like I said, I'm currently in a chapter dealing with World War II. We had the introduction of the Lend-Lease Act, and two of the sources was a radio address by FDR on the Lend-Lease Act, and a rebuttal by another radio address by a radio broadcaster with the last name Burton. And students, the room was divided into students on one side received the FDR reading, students on the other side received the Burton reading. And FDR, his radio address, of course, is supporting it, while the other one is opposing it. So students, they had a chance to read the primary source they were assigned, and based on the primary source, they were to create a point of view from the author. So this is FDR, and this is his point of view of why Lend-Lease is needed right now during the early stages of World War II. And students on the other side did the opposing point of view. And then what occurred was students broke into small groups, and they talked with one another about this is what FDR thinks and this is what Burton thinks. And while they created the summary statement, they also included the details. So it was once again the idea of let's build the Christmas tree so that the main statement by FDR or Burton is supported by facts. So that's another example of a Common Core standard that is accomplished in the classroom. Now moving down to the second category of the blue, PA Common Core standards represented in the curriculum but not at the level of high rigor supported by the PA Common Core standards. With this one, what I started with was Common Core standard letter D. Determine the meaning of words and phrases that are used in a text, including vocabulary describing political, social, economic aspects of history and social science. This is one of the Common Core standards I was not sure where I wanted to put it, whether it was a yellow or was it a blue. I definitely do a lot of definition vocab terms, but based on the part where it says including vocabulary describing political, social, economic aspects, I think there's room for improvement. What I put for the rationale: students are introduced to new words and phrases, discussion occurs on meaning of words, a greater effort to connect the words and phrases to the political, social, and economic aspects of history, the need to relate the term to historical context. An example is it's a German term, Untermenschen, which means subhuman. This is a term that's used with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to help describe the Jews and the Slavs from Eastern Europe. And it's a term that students have no familiarity with. So when we get to it, for me, here's the German term and this is the English translation of it. And that's just one example I think of as, I could do more with that so students understand that this term really is the basis for a lot of the hatred that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis have towards other groups of people, such as the Jews and the Slavs from Eastern Europe. So I just think there's room for me to improve and just not make it as simple as, okay, here's the term, this is what it means, and let's move on. More of, this is the term, let's find out what it means, and then what's the connection it has to the bigger picture that we're talking about today. The next Common Core standard, letter I, compare and contrast treatments of the same topic in several primary and secondary sources. Rationale: students use primary and secondary sources to develop and understanding of a topic. Sources are selected by the teacher to explain the topic. Differing views of topics through primary sources, secondary sources is part of the curriculum, but not to the frequency needed to make students proficient in the standard. Overall, I select the readings for the students, and I think probably the biggest obstacle is anytime students are reading, it's an activity that takes more time than a traditional lecture based classroom. And the way I interpreted this standard was, do I give students readings about the same topic but from different sources? So am I selecting multiple secondary sources about the same topic? That's my interpretation of the standard. I don't think that I do that. I think I give them multiple sources, but I don't think I actively seek finding, uh, 2 or 3 different primary or secondary sources about the same subject. For primary sources, I do that because I like the students to understand differing point of view from the authors. Secondary sources, I don't do that. I decide this is the source I think is the best to represent the information I want them to know, and that's what they read. So the example impact of September 11th on American security. When September 11th occurred, the way that we teach it is, of course, from the American perspective, and there's room for another perspective to be brought in, the perspective of uh, the Taliban, the perspective of Muslim radicals, and that's something that is not addressed because based on the American point of view, that's we're expected to teach it from the United States' point of view of what happened. So I think there's room there for me to improve. The next standard is letter H. Assess the extent to which the reasoning and evidence in a text support the author's claim. Rationale. Students explain the concepts found within text. Students create point of view summaries based on the text. The difficulty of building evidence from text is an obstacle. The building of evidence requires a greater time commitment when interacting with primary sources. I've learned through teaching that student-centered instruction can often take more time, and it's a challenge for teachers, and I think that's one of the big obstacles that many teachers have is, well, I can tell you what it says and it takes 5 minutes versus I'm going to let you figure out what it says, which is going to take 10 or 15 minutes. I've come to understand that student-centered instruction is important, and it's vital to actually having the students be interactive with the content and the instruction. But there are times when planning lessons, I may not use secondary sources or primary sources for the time restraint that I know it's going to place on the lesson. So it's something that I think there's room for improvement, and as you teach and you do lessons over and over, you realize how to become more efficient. And so one of the examples that I use is Harry Truman's statement on the atomic bomb. With this, students read the primary source and begin to develop the reasons why we decide, or Harry Truman decides to drop the atomic bomb during World War II. And there's a lot of information available on whether or not the bomb should have been used, but our perspective is we used the bomb to help end the war, to save American lives. So I think there's a great opportunity there to bring in other perspectives on whether or not the bomb should have been used in an area that could have improvement. The fourth standard is letter J. By the end of grade 10, read and comprehend history, social studies text in grades 9 through 10 text complexity band independently proficiently. You know, 'cause I think I do a decent job with really using primary and secondary sources, but I think where there's an issue is some students get it and they understand how to use primary sources and secondary sources. Other students just continue to struggle, and I think it comes down a lot to their reading ability, but also they may not know exactly how to tackle a primary source because when they see a very high level of reading, which many of the primary sources are, some of them I think they just simply feel that there's no chance of them being able to read it. The rationale: some students have the ability and skills to comprehend primary and secondary sources. Students can read and summarize the text, including the main concept and point of view of the primary or secondary source. The main obstacle is students' ability to read and comprehend primary sources and generate the author's point of view and support the point of view with factual evidence from the primary text. It really is a challenge, and from the time I started teaching back in 2003 to now, I've continued to use primary sources, but I've realized different ways that I need to implement them into the instruction and into the curriculum. It used to be you could give students a primary source and say read it and tell me what it says. And I think now there's different strategies that I use to help kind of make the primary source more interactive and more meaningful to them. But it's still an area that I continue to work on. Every single year, I think of new ways to keep using primary sources because I think some teachers in my department they really shy away from primary sources because they do realize the time commitment and the difficulty that some students have in reading primary sources. So it's just another area that I think I'm working on, but I think there's also room for me to continue to improve. Now, moving on to the last section, the pink. PA Common Core standards that are unfamiliar or not represented in the current curriculum. The first one, letter E, analyze how a text uses structure to emphasize key points or advance an explanation or analysis. Rationale: students are not taught about how the structure of the text helps in emphasis of key points. Most time is spent reading the text and determining the main concept or point of view. I don't really do this, and I know that from when I read the standard, I kind of had to think about it and say, what exactly are they asking? And my interpretation of the standard is: do I talk to the students about, okay, in this primary source, where is this information included? Why is it placed in the first paragraph versus the second or third paragraph? That's what I think the standard is asking or saying, and I don't do that. I guess that's something that I kind of feel is geared more towards an English teacher, but obviously based on the Common Core standard, it's something that I need to introduce and implement into my uh, lessons and instruction. The final standard is letter G. Integrate quantitative or technical analysis, charts, research data with qualitative analysis in print or digital text. Rationale: students use charts sparingly. Most charts are used for quick data. Even with charts being used, integrating the analysis of data is not a part of the curriculum. In the last chapter, Great Depression, there was a chart that students used which helped them determine the worst year of the Great Depression. I do have charts that I use and tables. So this was a standard that I thought maybe I should include it in the blue category. But when they start using words like qualitative analysis and technical analysis, to me, I don't have it. I'm not anywhere near that with the amount of charts that I use. So I decided to put it into the pink category just because I think those words alone make it something that I don't feel comfortable saying that I do. So that concludes the assignment for Unit 7, the PA Common Core in reading for social studies. And it was interesting to see the PA Common Core standards in reading, which I have seen before, but to actually connect them to the course that I'm teaching opened my eyes to, some of these I am doing confidently in my classroom, and some of the other ones I am doing, but there's still areas that I can improve on. And the last two are eye openers of, these are some things that I know I'm definitely missing right now, and things that I can begin to focus on in the future. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it.